Okay, as you probably can tell, I am not from this part of the world. In fact, I'm from Belfast in Northern Ireland, and I work for a treatment service that's based in England. So when I'm referring to home, I always tell them that I'm from the Northwest Colony, and it kind of gives them a little bit of a sort of a grin sometimes. Anyway, I'm not sure what they quite make of that, but that's what we do. All right, so I want to talk about a couple of things, and it's really going to be about pregabalin more so than gabapentinoids more broadly, and the drivers for their use, their involvement in overdoses, and then what we know about reducing harm for people that use them. If you think back to Vicky's presentation there was a slide showing 300 milligram, albeit fake, pregabalin capsules. The nickname for a drug in Belfast anyway is those are called buds. And the reason that they're called buds is because they look similar to the Budweiser colours, and also because people felt initially anyway that the effect was a little bit like an alcohol type effect. And another brilliant insight into people's thinking was that Bud Lights were gabapentin. So you had Buds and Bud Lights, which was quite interesting. Anyway, why am I talking about it? Well, because the first recorded issues, I suppose, with pregabalin seem to have come from Belfast, from the Royal Victoria Hospital, which is in a part of West Belfast on the Falls Road. And they were suddenly seeing masses of people coming in with overdoses, and it was connected to their use of pregabalin. So that was written up in, I think, the Journal of Emergency Medicine way back in 2010, and got us thinking a bit about what is actually happening here. And I'm firmly convinced that it's entirely to do with a troubled history. Our troubles, I suppose, are well known, well documented, and thankfully mostly a long time in our past. But the roots of the problems that we've had with pregabalin have been within our history from the late 60s onwards. And one of the ways that you can sort of see how it's so well ingrained into the national psyche is, don't know if anybody's ever heard of them, but there's a wee band called Kneecap. Obviously they're from Belfast, being called Kneecap. They're a hip-hop trio, and they sing partly in English and partly in Gaelic. They have a huge youth following, and they're kind of the post-conflict era young people, etc. And they're very used to, drugs like pregabalin and drugs like street benzos, and possibly their parents and grandparents, obviously on the diazepam instead. But interestingly, one of the drugs that is very often prescribed to you, if you have had the joy of having your kneecaps removed by some metal, is pregabalin, because of the fairly obvious nerve damage that can occur as a result of that. So my contention is that, if we look back, we'll find out why we're in the scenario we're in now. And it starts with the benzos. So the benzos came in really at a very, they came in at the right time for them, in a sense. So they came in at a time that barbiturate prescribing was going down, and because of the threat of overdose that barbiturates brought, benzos came in instead. And they got a real cult following, so to speak, in Northern Ireland, particularly in the areas of high deprivation and high conflict. So you can imagine the GP somewhere living out somewhere on the outskirts of Belfast, but he's got a surgery on, the Shankill Road, and Mrs. Jones comes into him and says, I can't sleep at night, I'm worried about my son, there's things happening all the time. And the GP's going, well, I can't do anything about what's going on in the community here, but I can certainly do something about the anxiety that is producing in you. And very often it was more prescribed to women, and the men would have tended to have gone to the pub, and I'm talking like 60s and 70s and 80s, before we had a much broader set of drugs that people can avail of now. So that idea of mummy's little helpers, people would have regularly swapped and given diazepams, blues, yellows, whites, by colour they were identified even rather than kind of by the drug itself. Of course, they're colours for diazepam tablets. But what do we know? By the 80s, we knew that there were significant harms associated with benzos. In fact, they tended to create more of the problem that they were originally designed to alleviate. And by the early 2000s, society had settled down, thankfully, and there was much more peace about. The Department of Health, in their infinite wisdom, gave advice to the prescribers to stop prescribing diazepam. Now, you can see, may or may not have been the right thing they have done, but it's had an unanticipated adverse effect, and one of the unanticipated adverse effects is that it led to this rapid increase in prescribing of gabapentinoids, particularly pregabalin. So those prescribed benzos went down, and pregabalin came up. Also, what we saw coming up, and more recently really since then, has been the increase in what you guys have seen all about. It's the street benzos, but they didn't come in until a bit later on. So that's how we think about pregabalin. So initially it was a drug which was prescribed for focal seizures, for people suffering with epilepsy. It then was running out of its license, I think 2014. I can't read this because I have no glasses on, but I think that's the right year. So another license was found for its use for neuropathic pain. The good thing about neuropathic pain, if you're looking for a drug to give you a bit of a wallop, is that all you have to do is like that. Oh, it's sciatica, sciatica. And everybody in the jails was just getting sciatica all at the same time. Then they all get out of the jails, they come back into their communities, their GPs are prescribing them pregabalin as well, and usually at 300 milligrams twice a day. So a problem that initially manifested in prisons soon went out into those communities, which were the same communities which were most affected by the Troubles way back when. But interestingly, after that is something else which has really exacerbated, I think, the issue. And that is that it was then available to be prescribed for generalized anxiety disorder. I mean, that's perfect. Generalized anxiety disorder, that really works. So many people who used to be prescribed diazepam and other benzos now found themselves being prescribed pregabalin. I'm going to go on and sort of talk about the issues with that, but in 2018, the ACMD gave advice that pregabalin and gabapentinoids should be controlled, so they became Class C controlled drugs, which of course, as we know, really fuels the drug market to respond, and it does, and has done so since then. And interestingly, that year, which was 2019 that it came in, we started to see the increase in deaths overtaking the deaths associated with diazepam. Also, again, in terms of persistent pain, as it's now called, rather than chronic pain, the NICE guidance came out a couple of years after that to say, look, you're not even getting so much as an ibuprofen here. You might get a little bit of low dose amitriptyline for neuropathic pain, but you ain't getting any of these other things, the oxycodones and the this, that, and the other thing. And look, there's, I think there's very good reason for that, but the problem is when you've got a population of people that have a high amount or a high incidence of pain, particularly persistent pain, whether that comes from their back or not, or originates actually in their head, that's not the point. What are you going to do with them? You can't just take them off these sorts of drugs and expect that the drugs market, the illicit market, won't respond as it always does. This was quite an interesting piece done by a guy, can't remember his name now, he's from Belfast too, nice fella. Anyway, he did this piece freelance for Vice, and he identified that it was amongst the heroin users that you found pregabalin was causing or involved with their deaths. We didn't have a huge sort of heroin problem in Northern Ireland until about but we didn't have a huge and consistent and cheap supply of heroin until about 2014 for a long lot of reasons. But since then it has come up with a bang. A lot of people now, or a lot of people in those intervening years, heroin dependent. Interestingly, nearly everybody that I see now who used to inject heroin in Belfast, particularly amongst the homeless community, or people who were rough sleeping or sofa surfing, they do not use heroin anymore. It's all injecting points of cocaine powder. In fact, I bumped into a young woman on Saturday that I used to know. She was in the local Neil Exchange and said, how's things going? She says, brilliant. No more gear, not using heroin anymore. Stopped, last September. In fact, I was the last one to stop. Nobody uses it anymore. And you go, yep, and why might that be? And the answer is that everybody got put on the Buvidal, and good knowledge, I'm sure that is. Wait to see the amount of injecting of cocaine powder that has gone on ever since that. Anyway, I digress, but it hardly seems to me a great benefit that people stop injecting heroin 3 times a day if they're now injecting 15 times a day a point of cocaine. Okay, so patterns of use. Used to talk about kind of the toxic trio: booze, benzos, opioids or heroin. Now we have to include the gabapentinoids, and particularly in our context it was pregabalin. And the increase in this, because of what was just mentioned there about the lowering the threshold for overdose, or lowering your tolerance to opioids, such that if you go on to use an opioid after you've taken a handful of pregabalin, your chances of overdose rise dramatically. But the other point to make about the pregabalin is it does offset some opioid withdrawals. So people are using it as a way to minimise the impact of the withdrawals of opioids, but also to make other depressant drugs stronger. For example, if you drank as well along them. Okay, so deaths involved in pregabalin in Northern Ireland. This is over 10 years, between 2013 and 2022. We don't have the figures for 23 yet. You can see that it came out of nowhere in 2013, and suddenly by 2019 had become hugely implicated in drug-related deaths in Northern Ireland. We don't have the same level of drug-related death. It's not far off the same rate, but we don't have the same level. Population's only 1.8 million versus I think it's 5 or 6 million perhaps in Scotland. So those numbers were significant. And this is how you can tell, I suppose, that this is the proportion of the times that pregabalin was mentioned in a death certificate versus the total number of deaths in those years. So from 2013, negligible. And then from about 2018 onwards, it's roughly about a quarter, sometimes a third. So that's one single drug involved a quarter of the time or a third of the time in every single drug-related death in Northern Ireland. And this slide's just saying the same, or this graph is just showing you the same thing against 100% of the drug-related deaths in each particular year. Okay, so diazepam versus pregabalin in Northern Ireland. Historically, diazepam was involved in more drug-related deaths than any other drug, but the trend has been diazepam deaths have gone down, and by diazepam I mean prescribed diazepam, whereas the pregabalin deaths have risen and risen. And they overtook diazepam in 2019 and have stayed significantly higher ever since then. So what do we do about it? I think it's fairly difficult. I think there are things that we know and we can do and do work. We need to understand the dosing that people take. We need to try and understand, the degree of dependence, if there is dependence. I mean, my view on it is it's not a good drug to end up becoming physically or psychologically dependent, but definitely physically dependent. The withdrawals from it are particularly unpleasant and long lasting. Similar, I guess, to the withdrawals from benzos, but they're also more physical in nature. So there's a degree of kind of opioid cluck with them, as well as all the kind of psychological sort of stuff that goes on with benzo withdrawal. So if you can avoid dependence, take tolerance breaks. Your tolerance rises very quickly with pregabalin, similar to the way it does with benzos like diazepam. If you're using alcohol, benzos or opioids as well, try and use less of each, especially if you're using all four, like really double down on your dosing, keep it low. Avoid, if you can, snorting or injecting, so oral administration would be better. If you are using a new supply, get it tested. test dose, sorry. The advantage that we've got with capsules and tablets, which don't cost a massive amount each, is that you can probably afford to send one off for testing or let one go for testing, whereas if you've just bought a bag of heroin, it's unlikely you're going to let go of that bag. In fact, very unlikely. So also plan for overdose. One of the messages that I'm certainly trying to use within our services in England is that everybody should have a plan for overdose, absolutely. And every worker should be thinking about every time they're seeing somebody, how am I going to ensure that this person comes back to see me, and how am I going to ensure that they're alive in order to do so. Those are the sorts of things we need deeply ingrained into workers' heads everywhere if we're going to try to get people on top of the risk of overdose. Let alone for Pregabalin, but also for all these other nasty things that are coming in. Don't know if any of you are familiar with this little booklet, something I was involved in writing a number of years ago. There were two, actually. There was a little series. This is the user guide to Pregabalin. You can get it on the net if you go to the Extern website, which was a previous employer of mine. You can get it and download. The other one is a worker guide or a staff guide. Both of them you can download and print off if you would find them helpful. We would certainly encourage staff to use it because it does give people a bit of an edge, a bit of an insight into the Pregabalin issues and how to reduce the risk. I mentioned briefly there about the withdrawal symptoms from Pregabalin. Withdrawals are, particularly difficult for a lot of people. I don't think that they're often understood as well, or we empathise as much as we should do. For example, I had quite a bad car accident a number of years ago and was prescribed Pregabalin, 300 milligrams twice a day, used for 3-4 years, something like that. And then I decided, look, I need to sort of just see if I can manage without so much Pregabalin here. So I decided to do a kind of a taper, and I based it largely on the Aston manual stuff, so similar to how you would do a benzo taper. And it was extremely tough, and it took a long time to come back to feeling like myself. I'll not go into the nitty-gritty of it, but some of it's pretty unpleasant. It was psychologically very difficult, and it was physically very difficult as well, and it didn't go after a few weeks. It was months and months and months of it. So one example was it took about 7 months before I got one normal night's sleep, which I would say is like 6 hours for me. So it really can impact, and I wasn't, using it, sort of the levels that some of the people that we might see and we might work with are, handfuls of the things. I was just using as prescribed and didn't think anything as difficult was going to occur, but it certainly did. It taught me a big lesson to be very, very cautious. Okay, so how do you manage withdrawal? Well, it depends whether the use is stable or unstable, if you know what I mean. It's somebody that's at a stable daily dose that they take every day, or whether it's somebody who's opportunistic, takes a whole handful, doesn't use for a week or whatnot, or somebody that's using like a yo-yo every day, day on, day off, bits here, low doses, high doses, etc. That yo-yoing of the dosing is a really, really difficult thing to get under control, and that's the first thing in terms of the harm reduction information that I would be talking to people about manage your dosing and try and get in control of it. Use whatever strategies that you have and you can think of to get your dosing to a regular level, because that will help you to manage the withdrawal if that's what you choose to do. A slow taper with flexible adjustments. In our field, of course, we support people to manage withdrawal that they desire, but we should also remember that it's them that's going to have to do it. It's them that's going to be awake at 3 and 4 and 5 o'clock in the morning, wondering how the hell can I not sleep? What's going on here? All the kind of anxieties that come up in the midst of a withdrawal. So little adjustments, can mean quite a lot. And when somebody needs to take a holiday from dropping down, that's grand. Even if somebody needs to go up for a little bit, that's fine too. They're in control of it because they're the ones that are going to have to live it out and sweat it out, quite literally. Expect similar symptoms to both benzo and opioid withdrawal, which I mentioned earlier. Ask about mood and ask about psychotic symptoms, because it does has a massive impact on mood, and for some people, unfortunately, psychosis happens, and it takes often 6 months, and that can be 6 months after stopping completely. So if you think about somebody's been using a high dose for ages before that, and they've kind of started to get a stable dose, maybe taking 12 months to get to the point of stopping, well, there's going to be potentially another 6 months before they kind of feed back to normal again. So it's a long-term thing. I'm finished. Thank you very much.